Welcome. Everybody hear me okay? Cool. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith for this very special event featuring Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein and Frankie de la Cretaz here to talk to us about Chanda's book, The Disordered Cosmos. My name is Adam. I'm a bookseller here at Brookline Booksmith. I first want to just thank everybody for coming out today. The Booksmith has been here for 60 years as of last year, which is really awesome, and that's because of the support of people like yourselves. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much, and also thank you for supporting the wonderful work of these authors here. Please keep your phones on silent throughout the event. Thank you so much for that. If you pre-ordered a copy of Chanda's book, you can pick it up over at the desk over there. We also have copies of Frankie's book. And they're obviously for sale also, so if you want to get one or two or three, totally your choice, you can totally do that. But we've all been so looking forward to tonight. It's such a pleasure to have Dr. Prescod-Weinstein here for the paperback release of her book, The Disordered Cosmos, in which she shares her love for physics, from the standard model of particle physics and what lies beyond it, to the physics of melanin in skin, to the latest theories of dark matter, along with a perspective informed by history, politics, and the wisdom of Star Trek. I first want to thank Frankie de la Cretaz for being here to moderate tonight's event. Frankie is the co-author of Hail Mary, The Rise and Fall of the National Women's Football League. Their work has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Sports Illustrated, and more, and has been featured in several editions of Best American Sports Writing. They've also been nominated for the top 10 honors from the Associated Press Sports Editor. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Frankie. And finally, the star of our show tonight, Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein is an assistant professor of physics and astronomy and core faculty in women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire. Her research in theoretical physics focuses on cosmology, neutron stars, and dark matter. She additionally does research in Black feminist science, technology, and society studies. Dr. Prescod-Weinstein is also a columnist for The New Scientist and Physics World. So without further delay from me, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here tonight, Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein and Frankie de la Cretaz.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here talking about Chanda's book, paperback. Also really excited to be doing this with you. I feel like we've been circling each other.
And running into each other at Connecticut Sun games.
Yes. You are a sports fan. Yeah, I feel like we've been circling each other for a really long time, so it's nice to be able to actually do something together. So
yeah, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, of course. Congratulations on your paperback, and you have won awards.
Yes, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize.
Which is very exciting. Can you talk a little bit about what the reception for the book has been like, and also what's new in paperback edition?
Oh yeah, so this is a big question, I guess. A book like this was, I feel like I should start by saying that getting publishers to take the idea of the book seriously was a challenge. And so the fact that it went on to win a Los Angeles Times Book Prize, I think is a big deal in a way, not just for me, but for the concept of doing a book that looks at science and takes a holistic look at it, making commentary on what it means to do the science and to really look at the whole big picture. So I guess the interesting thing for me was that I had this idea in my head that really what I wanted to do was write a book to girls from East LA, to young black girls, to black non-binary people who were maybe excited about the universe, but not necessarily finding a place for themselves in the narratives about the study of the universe. And that was what I thought about the whole time. And more broadly, I just wanted to welcome anybody who felt like the understanding and pursuing the study of the universe was not for them, that it was, in fact, for them. So part of what I had to deal with, actually, is that I had a lot of readers come to the book who don't usually read science books. And I didn't actually, I was so hype about this op that I was doing that I didn't really think through in practice what that would mean and what that experience would be like for people. All I thought about was wanting to impress upon people that the universe belonged to them too. And I didn't really think about what are the stories that they were bringing with them about what their relationship with science is. Maybe they had a teacher tell them that they sucked at math, that, like it was never going to be their thing, or they had a parent tell them that, or they just looked at their standardized test scores and those tests are terrible, right? So I was unprepared for how people were going to relate to the book through frames that I wasn't really thinking about. So there were people who were like, oh, this is a memoir, because they had never read a popular science book before and didn't know that all popular science books by scientists have like this piece of like, this is my personal journey, this is my relationship to the science. And so that was one thing that was unexpected. And so actually I wrote a note to the reader to reflect on this that appears in the paperback that kind of gets into the pieces that I feel like I missed, like not caring for the emotional journey of the reader who was maybe actually going to have something of a trauma reaction of like, I'm scared that I won't understand the science or that I don't understand the science, thinking that it was like a textbook with like a test at the end, which is totally not. So that's one thing that I had to kind of like reflect on in terms of the reception.
And so, is there any other additions to the paper?
Yeah, so I rewrote the opening of the physics of melanin, and there were changes throughout that one to make it flow better. And that's like, the funny thing about that chapter is that I thought that was going to be the easiest one because it's based on an essay I published in Bitch magazine in the winter 2017 issue. So that was the one where I was like, oh, I'm just going to cut and paste this. It was actually the chapter that was in my book proposal. So it was like, this is literally going to be a cut and paste. And then I actually had to, when I sat down to write it, I was like, there are all these things happening. One, the time had changed. That I didn't, when I wrote the first version, it was 2016, and we were talking about Black Lives Matter, but I don't think that the conversation looked the way that it did in 2019 when I wrote the first draft, in 2020 when I was working on the final drafts of the book. And so I had to kind of like grapple with, there are going to be some people who are not going to feel good about me being like, yeah, dark skin's fucking awesome. Because there were going to be some people who are like, I'm not feeling good about that. I'm not feeling good about the public discourse. And so trying to navigate bringing those two things into conversation with each other, even though they're in conflict with each other in some sense, right? And so now I understand that this is the chapter that I'm probably always going to be writing and rewriting in different ways. And it's the one that I can imagine might actually turn into its own project at some point. Because I think it deserves a much bigger expansion. And in my office on the floor, I have like a stack of books that I just kind of collect on this topic. So at some point I should probably do something with that.
Yeah, I think you're talking about people coming to this book that you maybe didn't expect. I am absolutely one of those people that I was a little bit like surprised at first when you asked me to do this with you because I don't really know anything about science. And however, something like I super appreciated, people don't actually know this, I studied the social sciences. My master's is in mental health counseling and like my undergraduate psychology. And I think there's this prejudice sometimes against like the social sciences and in people who study science, and this felt like you were explaining how they're actually like very, very linked. Can you talk a little bit more about that perspective?
So I should say, actually, I think I've only done one book event with another physicist. I think, yeah, and that was like 3 weeks ago. So
How was that? Was it different?
It was different, partly because it was like my master's advisor.
Okay.
So it was someone who had it was probably, of all the people that I did events with, he was the person who had known me the longest because he's known me for almost 20 years at this point. It was also funny because he just didn't remember things correctly about how we met, and so there was a lot of me sitting there correcting him. But I think it was different in the sense that because he doesn't think about these social issues in the same way, that conversation ended up looking more like a conversation that I might typically have in a physics department, as opposed to a conversation that I've been having with these, mostly with the virtual events, because they've mostly been completely virtual. One of the questions that I get asked, which is I think related, is to your question, is how do I bring those things together? How do I manage it?
Yeah.
And I think part of the point is that it's not something that I manage. it's what happens. It's how my brain works in relation to what I do. So actually, a really good example of this is that I was on I was listening to a talk this morning. So someone's pulled together people who think about dark matter from around the United States. This is one of the nice things about the Zoom world, is that we do these things now. So someone was giving a talk, and at the end, I basically wanted to ask him what he thought the goal of his work was, in terms of, is his goal to understand what dark matter is doing, or is his goal to understand what dark matter is? And the question for me was a social science question. Like, I was trying to understand how he was thinking about doing his work, but it was also for me a scientific question, because I wanted to know if he was thinking about using galaxies as a tool, or if he wanted to think about galaxies for the sake of understanding galaxies. And so I think that's a really good example. I had to confess, I was like, this is partly my social science brain, but that's also now how I understand the scientific questions and try and make sense of what my colleagues are doing. And so I think as I wrote, those two things were naturally coming out. I think the thing that's surprising is when I put the book proposal together, I really thought the book was going to be a collection of essays based on things that I had already published online, that were going to be about problematizing science and how science is done, and telling people what is broken about how the scientific community functions. And I didn't really go into it thinking that I was going to put a whole lot of science into it. And then I realized, and this is where, Dreams Deferred is in the subtitle, that I didn't graduate from high school being like, yeah, I really want to have a bad experience in science and then have to try and figure out the problems, right? I wanted to write my own A Brief History of Time. That was my dream. And so I was like, I now have this captive audience. I have the book contract. I have to do at least 70,000 words. Let some of them be about the science. What ended up happening holistically is that I think the way the book works, to the extent that it works, is that you come in with that sheer joy and interest in the science, and the reason that the ending and the fight for it is compelling to you is because you had that moment of sharing the joy and the excitement. And so I think that, in fact, the science is necessary for that social commentary. And the social commentary also motivates you for why we should fight to stay connected with the science.
I think that's actually something that links our work if you substitute science for sports, right? There was a line where you locate yourself in the opening of the book. Like kind of literally and societally, you locate where you come to the work, the science, the world. And you have this line about how who you are matters in science. And when you are looking at the world from the margins, right, it impacts how you see it, how you perceive it. You're going to see things that other people aren't. And I think about that a lot. I think that's a relationship between our work, right? I am looking at sports from a lens that a lot of people often are not. And I really appreciated that. And you give the reader that location and allow the reader to locate themselves too when you locate yourself first.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this is kind of a new thing in social science publishing these days, which is for people to kind of include an author social location statement. What it's actually called is actually escaping me right now, but where you're supposed to kind of say, I don't even know how to describe it, because the way it gets treated sometimes is people then just are like, this is my list of privileges. And so part of it was that I wanted to say things about who I was and where I was from for the purposes of serving the narrative and helping the reader orient themselves, not for the purposes of being I just want to make sure that I've checked off a list so that everybody can feel comfortable that I have acknowledged. And so actually the interesting thing was, God, I've been pretty good about not reading reviews or anything like that, but I happened to see one comment. I forget why I was looking at Amazon. Please don't buy your books on Amazon. But I was looking at that page. I think maybe I was trying to find the ISBN number or something like that. And I happened to see a comment that somebody was like, she felt too guilty about being light-skinned, which is something I grapple with in the physics of melanin, and I think is like a very necessary thing for me to do. As a light-skinned person, to point out that this is an easier chapter for me to look at in a particular way, because it's not so written on the body for me in the same way that it is for other people. So the interesting thing is like you bring yourself into it in order to kind of help people orient themselves, and then there are like those bad faith readers, like
Yes.
no matter what you do. But I think ultimately I wanted to make sure that people who are usually on the margins in the literary community and in the reading community felt very much like their experience had been attended to. I realize it's ironic given what I just said in answer to the previous question, but I had lofty aspirations.
I think you achieved what you were going for, honestly. Another thing, I mean, when we talk about like locating yourself, you end that introduction with a bracha, which is a Hebrew prayer. It's for the universe, and I like actually had the physical response about seeing that I'm also Jewish, and it felt like very like meaningful to me. And I wanted to ask you about the importance of bringing that aspect of your identity and like making that visible in the work. Why that felt important to include.
Yeah, so you're not the first Jewish person. Like I've had people say like when they got to that part they cried. And it says a lot about what assimilation calls on people to do. Because when you think about physics, you don't think of like, you know, white Jews as a particularly like underrepresented group, right? Like the most famous physicist to ever live is definitely the archetype is like old white Jewish guy, right? But in a sense, people are called to be very secular and called to not engage with their tradition and not to foreground that tradition. And so I think that was dramatically different from things that I had seen other Jewish scientists do. Honestly, putting the prayer, so there's the prayer there, and then there's also a prayer at the very end of the book. I was really paranoid that the book wouldn't be Jewish enough. And so I was like, I'm just gonna like be really not subtle and slap it on in there. And so my rabbi, Rabbi Tova Spitzer, who also has a book out that just came out a couple of months ago, which I can't remember.
God is here.
God is here. Thank you. Rabbi Tova helped me pick out the prayers, and then because we're Reconstructionists, I was like, so which translation should I use? And she was like, well, here are some suggestions, but you can like say whatever like you feel that the interpretation that the prayer should be. So the English that you read is not a literal translation, but is my interpretation into language that made sense to me. I guess the irony is that, the Jewish press ended up taking a lot of interest in the book.
Oh, yeah.
And people picked up on a lot of things that they felt were Jewish in the book. And I was like, oh, I didn't even realize, like, I had Jewed out, didn't even know about it.
Right, but then that, like, fear of, like, not being, like, Jewish enough, it's like, it's Jewish even if you never say it because you're Jewish, right? And, like, but it's still...
So, I mean, and there's definitely an element of that's racialized, right? Of, like, my experience of being a Jew of color, and being a patrilineal Jew of color, and so knowing that my Jewishness is going to be a question for some people, or that, like, sometimes people seem, my last name is hyphenated Prescod-Weinstein, and they assume that I married into the Weinstein, right? And so feeling a little bit of, like, I need to affirm this or not have people say that I chose my blackness over my Jewishness. And I think that there was, and in that sense, I think just to go back to the question of, like, how was the book received, I think I went through an experience of synthesis of what it means to be Black Jewish, through talking about the book with the Black press and with the Jewish press simultaneously, and realizing that it was all synthesized in that book, that I had actually done that.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
one of my favorite chapters is the chapter where you talk about dark matter, and so I'm coming from outside of science, so I didn't know about
Outside of physical science. You're a social scientist.
Okay. Physical science. There we go. Outside of physical science, but like, so I didn't know, right, that dark matter is often used as this like corollary for blackness, and that you disagree with that, and I found that really fascinating, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like that chapter and your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I should start by saying, so dark matter is like I literally just gave an example earlier where I said I was listening to this talk about dark matter. That's what I do all day in theory when I'm not dealing with bureaucracy anyway, which is like way too much of a professor's job. There was actually a rant about that in the book that I mostly removed because I didn't think it served narratively. So dark matter, we think, actually comprises most of the gravitating matter in the universe. So most of the normally gravitating matter in the universe is not visible matter like the stuff that we are made of, and is not luminous matter, that's what we might call it. And so it's actually the stuff that seems to be completely invisible to us, or at least it's something that doesn't radiate light to first approximation. So the way that it gets talked about, and even the nomenclature of dark matter, suggests that maybe it's dark because it blends in with space, and people have this idea that space has a color associated with it, that space is literally like the sky is black, right? And so this has had the interesting side effect of just the fact of calling it, for example, dark matter instead of clear matter or invisible matter, has led people to envision it as something that has a color associated with it, like maybe it's melanated. And so there's actually a discourse that has arisen in Black studies where people compare Black people to dark matter. And at some point this jumped over to white physicists also using that analogy, which is actually how I first found out about it. And I was livid. I was like, how dare you compare us to invisible matter? And there was a piece of it that was particularly in this moment where we are now hearing these stories about like, oh, well, the cell phone looks like a gun, and there was this kind of like magical shape-shifting transformation capability that Black people have. That this idea that Black people are made of a completely different type of matter than white people, I think is deeply problematic. And so I will say, I was just saying the physics of melanin was hard because I feel like I'm going over it over and over again, but I actually think that this was the scariest chapter for me because it was one that involved critiquing the community that I felt like I was writing to the most. And as a kind of like noob from the physics community who's made the move into working in Black studies, I've also learned that people in the humanities can be real harsh with each other, right? And so, one, I didn't want to kind of reproduce, like, I wanted to be able to say, like, look, I disagree and I don't think that this is right, but I also wanted to, like, how to connect in a felt way that was like, I understand why. Like, I understand where that came from, even if I disagree with where you landed. And I also wanted to do it in a way that, like, didn't have people, like, dragging me for filth. I was worried about that. I was worried that I would miss the mark with it. And I do think I'm aware of at least one person who feels that way about it.
As a reader, I could tell there was, like, reverence and respect for that came through to me. I actually had the thought this was really like well done. It's clear that it comes from a place of respect and discourse, and that's so much what public thought in general is, right? About just like engaging and creating with discourse.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be hard to disagree, and I think that academia does not encourage people to disagree in a generative way, in a way that is community building and warm. And in fact, there's a lot of incentive for the opposite. There's a lot of incentive to be nasty with each other, even I guess actually the example that I will pick about, and this is not just an academic thing. I think this is anything where you're dealing in information. So as a lot of people are aware, like the New York Times recently did a whole package of stories about Haiti and how they were just robbed over and over again by France and also by the United States. And the New York Times handled the rollout really badly. It's a really important story, and it's great that they are finally covering it, but there was no sense of taking responsibility for how many times over the years they passed up the opportunity to cover the story and chose to frame Haiti as this like mysteriously black and poor, right? So not taking responsibility for why that story was in such wide circulation. But also that they treated it like they were the first people to ever talk about the story, right? And so there's a lot of incentive to be that person who's like, no, I'm the one who came up with this. And so I wanted to avoid, even I introduced like this alternative, like let's think about weak gravitational lensing as an analogy. I don't particularly make a strong case for it because like I'm perfectly fine if people don't use it, right? Like that's really, for me, the goal isn't that like I have to be the one that people cite or the one that has to be at the center of the conversation. And I work in an environment where it's very hard to stay centered on that orientation because all of the pressures are in another direction.
So one aspect of the book that I'm really excited to talk to you about, I remember when it first came out and you and I were talking and you were telling me like I think of this as a queer book and like maybe kind of I would say yes, a trans book. But it wasn't being marketed that way really, and it wasn't being picked up by whether it was queer lists or queer publications, and there was a little bit of a sense of frustration or erasure or like invisibility there. And I wanted to ask you about that piece of like writing to me, putting your own queerness and your agender identity into the book, and still like maybe at times not having that scene.
So my agent might be watching, so forgive me, Jessica, but I'm just going to say that the publisher rejection that I continue to be like most salty about was one where a non-binary editor was like, I don't see what the point of the agender chapter is. And it was like, you could have just said, we don't think that this book works for us. You didn't actually have to make a point of being like, this part is the broken part of this book proposal. And we could have a whole separate conversation about the publishing industry and what people think they can sell and therefore what people try to sell. And basically they were like, we're not even going to try and sell that, right? I don't know, I guess I'm just going through and I'm being like, no, I have a problem with that chapter and I have a problem with that chapter. So the anti-patriarchy agender was actually the chapter that was like, in my own drafting, the worst written one. And I had a friend of mine, a mathematician who is a trans woman, look at it, and she was like, you've said everything in the wrong order. And basically like reorganized it for me. And I think part of the difficulty in writing about that is that there was literally no guide of how to write about, actually there wasn't even really a guide about how to write about being agender in any context.
Sure.
Like, there was just like no guide for that. And there was no guide for how to write science and agender identity together. And so I was like making it up and feeling extraordinarily self-conscious about how there were going to be some readers who came to the book because it was about physics or because they felt really strongly about race, and then they were going to be like, what is this? Or that there might be trans readers who were going to come to it and be like, she did not represent things the way that I want things to be represented. Even down to when I first was publicly telling people that I was agender, I would have people come to me and say, you really shouldn't be using she, her pronouns anymore. If you really want to support the community, you should move to they, them. And so feeling like, again, maybe similarly with the with being Black and Jewish at the same time, there was this kind of, I think if in the chapter, if I was reading it, I was not the author. Of course, the author always says this. There's a trepidation in it. I don't know how much of this I'm allowed to own, and I think I still feel that way about it. So even like the question of, is it a trans book? I sort of dance around that question.
So that's why I named it. I'm gonna name it.
Yeah, I will take that, but right, like I didn't feel like that was something I could claim. And I think there's also a community, there's a cultural value element of that, which is that the values that I grew up with is that you don't claim community title and heritage for yourself without other people being invested in why you can claim that legitimately. And that's a complicated conversation right now in terms of trans identity and gender identity. So, and I think that, queerness is futurity, and so I'm always going to be thinking about, like, where is that boundary? The thing that I wanted to avoid, my hesitation about claiming trans, was that that is something that would be easy for me to do, and then not be too affected by it. And I didn't want to take a role or a place that belonged to someone for whom it was very altering or challenging in their lives in a particular way. And I don't know, as I say that, I'm not sure that it sounds good, but I was like very, very concerned about making sure that I wasn't taking up space that I didn't need to be taking.
I will just say it's like an incredibly relatable thing that you just said, because like when I was coming out as trans and I'm like, I present this certain way and I pass a certain way, and can I, and then once you're a public figure who writes about like transness, whether it's yours or somebody else, then you are like the public figure, the expert, and so and I was like, who am I to claim, right? I think that that's like an incredibly common experience. I think it's a very trans experience.
I mean, I think like in relation to your book, one of the things that I wondered about was you're writing specifically about women football players, right? And you're doing it as a non-binary person. And you're working on the book as you're dealing with the coming out process, and also doing some of your first stories on trans issues in sports for major publications. And I wondered, like, was there a feedback loop? See, look at how I flipped the switch. I wondered if there was like a feedback, like, as you were engaging with that was shaping your identity. Were they separate? Did it challenge you?
So I will say the hardest part for me, and what I no one in this book we tell you is trans. There are trans people in this book, and there were trans people in this league, and we know that because like trans people are everywhere, and I think that's a lens that for me I was very aware of. I was interviewing some players who said to me in no uncertain terms, I think if I was young now, I might identify myself differently, but I don't think I can claim that, right? And there were several players who I very much got that sense, and I'm not going to put a trans identity on those people, but I can say they're probably not cis, right? Like they're engaging with me in this way. Since the book has published, we've actually found out about 2 trans players that were in the league. One, a trans woman who played on one of these teams in the 70s, and someone else who transitioned after
I want to read that.
playing, right? I'm working on that research.
That's amazing.
But so I think what you get is like, I'm going to go into an interview and I'm going to say, yeah, it's about a women's football league, but like, there's trans people in this book, whether we want to claim it or not. And so that's a perspective that probably, and I think this is where it gets sticky because it's women's sports that's having to grapple with trans participation mostly in a way that, men's sports really isn't. And it was very important. We have a blurb on the back of this book from Leisha Clarendon, who's a WNBA player, and they're an openly trans professional athlete. And so that was another way. I think that was a blurb that meant a lot to me, and that I asked them if they would provide, and was excited when they said yes, because I thought it was another example of like someone who's not a woman but plays women's sports, like putting their name on this book.
And Leisha is the athlete that you covered. Did you do a story on Leisha?
I did for Sports Illustrated.
For Sports, I'm just going to point that out.
Okay.
There is a fantastic.
They won the award that was mentioned in my bio.
So actually, listen listening to you talk about that has me thinking about the ways in which it has maybe shaped my scholarship a little bit. And so I think, so in the anti-patriarchy agender, I bring up this idea of white empiricism that I've been working on in my philosophical work. That's really about how whiteness and patriarchy combine together to shape how physics is done, and therefore what scientific knowledge we come to know through physics as a mode. When I'm giving professional, like academic talks about this concept about white empiricism, I use a concept from Imani Perry's work called the ideal patriarch. And the ideal patriarch, so I won't get into it, I'll just say read Vexy thing. It's highly, if you're looking for an introduction to Black feminist theory, it's highly readable, the citations are great, etc. And it's basically, the ideal patriarch is someone who can own property and who can really own the property of being a person, and how that is defined legally shifts through time. And so in listening to you talk about it, I'm realizing that I think the reason I like working with the ideal patriarch is that that gets to the heart of the thing without needing to focus on woman as the essential concept. And without needing to focus on one gendered or one sexed group as the thing that's not the ideal patriarch, right? That for me it's easy to say, this is the thing that I want to problematize and ask questions about. And everybody who's outside of that is on the other side of that, right? And then, so in some sense that's what I hear you saying about people who are not women playing women's sports, that it's really people who can't be on the field with the ideal patriarch.
Which is exactly how in that story that I talk about for Sports Illustrated, like I come to the, so I didn't know this as I was researching the story, and I was asking all of the professional leagues whether they had a trans inclusion policy. The men's leagues were like, we don't actually need one because there's no gender requirement. I hadn't thought about it. It's like, oh, the word men isn't even in their name. In theory, anyone can be drafted into this league, and there are women that have been drafted into like the NBA, for example. And so then it comes to the question of why women's leagues have to exist if they can technically play in the men's, right? And it becomes, oh, they're being denied professional opportunities because of who they are. And if you go to like the intent, I think you can make the argument that people, you know, and so it's like you're outside of this one, you know, you're being excluded from. I think that's, yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, the place where I see a parallel there is in the question of what is the purpose of bringing this group of people together. What are they supposed to be doing together? What is the purported goal? And actually, both physics, both theoretical physics in particular, I think we have particle physicists have a particular reputation in the physics community for being like the worst of the community. But in both of them, your goal is to win, right? It's to win at having the equation that understands the universe. It's to win at being right. I think that's like the masculinist narrative.
Yeah.
And that's also like, look, I don't want to undercut, like I watch those Connecticut Sun games. They go hard.
They do.
I had to quit junior Olympic level track as a kid because I did not go hard in that way. Like I did not have that level of interest. But I do think that there are underlying questions there about what the purpose of the group is, and therefore how do you select what qualities the members of the group have to have, and whether it is all about like who can smash the thing the hardest, right? And so like we watched the NCAA like March Madness, and it was really interesting. We mostly watched women's games. And then going back to watching men's games, we were like, why are the men like not good at this?
That was actually they're not. The women have better fundamentals. The men just like dunk over each other.
Right. I mean, and you see that. I mean, it's much clearer when you look at like women's soccer in the United States, and the women's team is like just dramatically better than the men's team. Like it's like, and like the women's team should probably be giving them tips and like doing outreach with them to encourage the men to play better and like learn their sport. But I think really watching that made me realize it's just they pass the ball differently. Like they literally throw the ball differently. And the presumption is, if you've grown up watching men play, that the way that men play is the way it should be done, and then women have to try and emulate that, as opposed to, so I think we see similar, I think there are similar questions in science, which is like, how much of our assumptions about how the work has to get done is rooted in bad ideas about what's efficient.
Yeah, or even the questions that you raise about, like, you know, blackness being abnormal and whiteness being normal, and it's about the lens of, like, if we're comparing it to white as the default, right? And then
Yeah, I think you summarized the Black people are luminous matter chapter better than I did, which is like part of the problem is this idea that white people are the norm, right? And that when you talk about Black people, all you can ever do is compare them to white people.
yes. This is why I get frustrated when people talk about women athletes as they're the female so and so. I'm like, could they just be like? Do we have to anyway?
Like, I mean, similarly in the, you know, one of the big projects of like the 2010s was finding the African Einstein. And I was like, or you could just like ensure that Africa is restored for all of the resources that were taken for several centuries, and then like let folks work it out. Part of it is the there's so many insidious assumptions going in there, but let me pick one. One of the insidious assumptions is that unless white people from the West motivate Africans, that Africans won't take an interest in the natural world. Or that indigenous people, more broadly, won't take an interest in the natural world. Which is wild, because then when you think about like the stereotypes about indigenous people, it's that they are part of the natural world in a way that like Westerners aren't. So there's like this kind of like, you're part of the natural world, but you're not curious about it. And so this idea is like, we have to motivate them to look at the sky, and it's like, yo, they were looking at the sky. Like they didn't need your help. Like, and so I think that again, it's a question of frame, and whose frame is at the center of the conversation.
I want to make sure we have time for folks to ask questions. So if you have any questions for Chanda, I would like to open that up now.
No such thing as a stupid question.
I have a question.
Can you speak up? Yeah.
No, I have a question. So is there something from your book that you could read that would relate to some of what you've been talking about?
You're requesting a reading? Is that what's happening?
I'm sitting here being confused. And I am a scientist. And I've never understood physics. I'm more of a biology, chemistry type scientist. And I even like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe and all that, I don't understand how theoretical physics relates to how I see the world or how I see people, or you know what I mean? I can't make I understand what you're saying, I appreciate what you're saying, but I cannot put that together.
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll just describe a little bit about how the book is structured. So the book is structured into 4 phases, which is roughly meant to mirror the different phases that matter goes through. So I start out by just really focusing on particle physics and explaining things about particle physics that I find exciting. Particle physics and cosmology. So what's inflation? So we are not sure the Big Bang happened, but right after whatever happened, the universe expanded really rapidly. But along the way, even as I'm trying to just talk about the physics there, I have to get into why people use the phrase colored physics sometimes, and how when I had to sit through a class reading that over and over again, it sat funny with me as a Black person in a way that it didn't sit funny with my white classmates, right? And so even in that section, things are starting to come to the surface where there's clearly social practices that are shaping how we even think about the science. So that phrasing, colored physics, comes in when we're talking about something that has no color whatsoever. It's something completely not intuitive. It's from from quantum field theory. It really has nothing to do with color in any sense of the way that we think about color. And so I think part of what I'm hearing in your question is, I don't see why these things would go together. And part of where I was, when I was getting started as a physics student, was I don't see why all of these social things are becoming factors when, like, I just want to learn about the cosmos. And so part of what unfolds in the book is how those things start to come together. So the physics of melanin, I really think of as kind of like the core in a way, because in that chapter I talk about how melanin is this incredible molecule that also is a fascinating material that has implications for how we understand superconductors. But it also has implications for like whether you can walk down the street and like breathe, right? And so that's, in some sense you're like, but why should those things be related? And what I'm saying in the book is like, right, why? Like, why should how much melanin you have in your skin and this incredible molecule be a social determinant of like how long your life will be?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So I really think your ideology is so interesting in terms of the way the science field operates and like what looks like success in the science field and like in physics and just the competitive nature of it all. And so I'm curious because you talk about this kind of not the like masculine way of doing things. And I so agree on that, but I'm curious how you bring that into your day-to-day life, how you bring that ideology into practice, maybe with students or with other coworkers or things of that sort.
Yeah, I will say, I think that it's hard, right? And definitely, one of the things that's interesting about the timing of when I wrote the first draft of this book is that I had only been a professor for a semester when I wrote the first draft. And so I was still writing very much from the point of view of someone who was a postdoctoral fellow and hadn't seen that side of things. And I'm glad that I wrote at that moment, because I think you guys would just get like a cynical tirade about bureaucracy and emails and trying to run a university as a corporation being total garbage. So one of the pressures that I am experiencing is the incentive is for me to push my graduate students to squeeze as much as I can out of them, because that helps me get tenure, and that helps me get grant money, and that helps me get tenure, right? And so I have to actively be aware of that pressure and not let it get into my conversations with my students, or be frank with my students and say, these are the pressures that are working on me. I'm trying as much as possible for them not to affect you, but these are the pressures that are working on me. And so I think part of it is about being honest about the systems that are at work, as opposed to I'm being like, oh, students shouldn't know about that stuff, or students shouldn't think about that stuff. I also actually think like I have a pretty serious practice of boundary setting with my students for related reasons, which is they're not responsible for me emotionally. And I don't know, you hear stories about academics and you're like, you cried and asked your student to reassure you, like, what's wrong with you, right? So even in thinking about, I have a chapter in the book called Wages for Scientific Housework, where I talk about the importance of janitors emptying the garbage so that your office isn't overflowing with garbage, which allows you to get work done. And so recognizing that that work is a contribution to the scientific process. But similarly, I have to continuously be aware of the labor dynamics around the contributions that the graduate students are making to my success. That when I go and I give talks, I make sure I say my student's name when it's a project that they take in a leading or a contributing role in. And that my ego doesn't get caught up in needing to take credit for that without including them. That's a really, I don't know, that sounds like really basic, but at the end of the day, it's not glamorous, right? You're just like, I have these values, I have to live my values, and I have to live these values bureaucratically. Right? And then I think the other piece of it is, advocating for them to get paid better. This is, and that's something that's I don't have control over in some really significant ways. But I can't just be like, well, I don't have the power to change it, so I'm going to stop talking about it.
Thank you.
Did you nod at me? You talked about the white empiricism and how that sort of influences a lot of how we view science and a lot of science work. How do you kind of reconcile with that in your own research? Do you try to not let it influence you, or because you're working within the system, you kind of have to, you know, operate around those things and you know, kind of exist with it, even if it's not the best?
Man, I've never actually been asked that question before, so thank you.
No
Because
problem.
I haven't been asked that question. So, I mean, I think like maybe another way of thinking about the question that you've asked is, how does white empiricism become part of an individual's life, right? And so, certainly when I was developing the idea, I was really thinking about myself as being on the losing end of it, right? Which is like having people disbelieve me when I say that I've experienced racism. And so having people throw out the empirical data that I'm offering them about my experience. But there's certainly a risk, so I'll give maybe an example that I think falls into the right realm of things. In the particular area of dark matter physics that I work on a particle called the axion. So I talk about this in the book if you want to know more. There are a bunch of Mexican researchers who had been writing interesting papers about this, that when I first started working on the axion, I did not know about those Mexican researchers because the Europeans and Americans that I was reading were not citing them. And so at some point, I put this all together, and then it became a matter of, it is now my responsibility to cite Mexican researchers and to build projects that involve citing them. So I have a project that actively I developed because it was a good scientific idea for my postdoc, and it had also involved not only citing this Mexican team, but actually building research links with them. And so then the other piece of it was making sure that one of the leading researchers, that I got him a conference invitation. And then when we were at that conference, I had a conversation with him. I was like, what resources do I have that I can share? I would like to work with you. And one of the challenges that the group there faces is that they work in Spanish, but most of the job market is in English. And so even, for example, making sure that the students get an opportunity to practice giving talks in English and engaging with people in an English-speaking setting, right? That because when it's hard for Mexicans to get visas to the United States sometimes, but also because the resources aren't necessarily there for travel, that they're less and because they're less likely to get invited to conferences, that all of those opportunities are smaller in number, right? So I think that's an example of a place where I have started to proactively think. I was complicit in that because it didn't even occur to me to go looking for papers from people in Mexico, right? And there were papers where I didn't cite folks, and so now I have to do my part to clean that up. So I think that's an example of how you might think that that's not racialized, but obviously the way Latinx is constructed in the American context, there are racializing components of it.
You can take it. I saw that you had a question as well, is that?
I think I forgot it in my conversation. I guess I was thinking about your colleagues, right? How do they receive you interweaving your physics with these other fields? And do you feel like they are open to it? What is their reaction, I guess?
So by the time the book came out, I guess I had a reputation, right?
Yes.
So just to go back to the white empiricism paper, I've definitely had a couple of younger white men be I really thought I was gonna have a reaction to the paper, and then I read the paper and I was like, yeah, that makes sense, right? Which is that's great. Like,
Yeah.
because it's not about individuals, it's about systems that are broken,
Right,
it's about
absolutely.
structures that are broken, right? And so like we can all be invested regardless of identity in addressing that and unpacking that, right? UNH hired me knowing exactly who I was. I heard that one of my colleagues like went back and read every tweet that I had written for a year, which must have been a slog because I write a lot of tweets.
I
should
have
follow
heard
Chanda
that.
on Twitter.
Yeah. So
No, I follow you on Twitter, so I know.
Yeah.
I know.
so they knew what they were signing up for, and I think I really like my department at University of New Hampshire, and I think that people understood that even when we disagree, that I wanted to take us in a direction of building a better community of practice, and that they were willing to give me the opportunity for University of New Hampshire to be a place where I did that work, and I'm really grateful for that. And we have like a super collegial department. There are definitely people in the community who like hate me. For sure. There are people I could name, like big name people, who make it a mission to trash me at every opportunity that they get. I will also say there's been an incredible network of like women who have backed me. So in fact the organizer of the Dark Matter session that I was at this morning, Priya Natarajan, is someone who has been a huge champion for me. Those networks of people who are willing to be champions are really, really important. I will say that also sometimes I've benefited. So I got an email just a couple of days ago from a scientist in Australia who someone recommended the book to him. He read the book and decided to look me up and realized that I was writing papers about an idea, but applying it in dark matter that he worked on. And he sent me an email and was like, we should chat. I knew exactly who he was because I had been reading his papers and using them as inspiration for my work for years.
That's awesome.
So it actually turned out to be professionally beneficial for me. And he came to the work through the book, right? And I'm not sure he ever would have heard that we were using these ideas for dark matter research if he hadn't read the book. And so that's like another example, just going back to assumptions about how it all has to happen. That's not how it's happening, but nonetheless, it's translating into science.
That's awesome.
Yes. I'm pretty hype about talking with him, actually. I have like so many questions.
That's really awesome. That is our time. It's been really lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.
Chanda will be signing books at the back. We can find them back there. Yeah.
Thank you. No?